Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into Chapter 13 of the book The Death of Utopia, unpacking a profoundly personal and intense narrative. The author, Jose Joao Maguza C. Edco, gives us a really raw, unfiltered look at his own descent into an underground armed movement in the Philippines back in the early 1990s. We're going to take an objective, structured look at this profound transformation. How does a normal, idealistic young person get drawn into a violent ideology? And what was the exact philosophy that finally helped him break free?
Okay, let's dive right into this. How does a regular Catholic college student studying in the city end up deep in a jungle guerrilla camp holding a rifle? It's wild to think about, right? But the answer isn't some sudden, overnight flip. As you'll see, it's a calculated, gradual process of psychological reshaping. Let's trace this timeline chronologically.
Part 1. The first knock, from classroom to underground.
So, our story actually kicks off back in 1991. Take a look at the author here, just a regular freshman at San Sebastian College, Recoletos. Now, you might picture the underground movement operating totally in the shadows, right? Actually, no. It was right out in the open. They didn't start recruiting with a weapon. They started with a literal knock on a classroom door. Activist students would initiate these room-to-room discussions to deliver what they called the basic mass course, speaking incredibly passionately about injustice, poverty, and change. And you know, those are topics that naturally and powerfully resonate with an idealistic young mind.
The tactics here? Absolutely surgical. We're talking small group, highly emotional persuasion. The author talks about how his bedroom at home slowly morphed into this shrine of radical books. Basically, they were systematically swapping out his family bonds for a new ideological family. And they expertly crafted this James Bond fantasy. By giving young recruits aliases and covert tasks, they made them feel incredibly special and important. I mean, for a kid wanting to make a difference, that's an intoxicating hook.
Moving on to Part 2, Anatomy of Terror Grooming.
The author actually breaks down his own recruitment using a specific analytical framework he terms terror grooming, and it happens in these very distinct steps. Step 1 is early identity re-anchoring, giving the recruit a new in-group and a whole hero narrative to believe in. Then, Step 2, emotional arousal. Think massive, high-energy rallies. Step 3 is all about incremental commitment, nudging a student from merely attending a meeting to actually organizing one. And finally, the most crucial part, Step 4, social isolation, cutting them off from old friends and family until the movement is literally all they have left. The old identity is systematically erased and replaced.
Which brings us to Section 3, the jungle reality.
At this point, the author is miles away from being a student in Manila. He's operating under aliases, Ka Jasper, Ka Ugboy, deep in the jungles of Bataan. And here is where the massive disconnect hits. On one hand, you have this utopian promise, absolute brotherhood, historical destiny, and ultimate justice. But the reality on the ground? It's starkly different. He recounts surviving under intense military constriction, enduring starvation, extreme paranoia. It's a grim existence where everyday morality is just suspended, all for the cause. And there's this incredibly specific, honestly heartbreaking detail from Chapter 13. Even in this deep, intense isolation, he held on to this tiny tether to his old life. He was actually writing letters to his mother on the backs of juicy fruit gum wrappers. His mom would write to him in English, and he'd reply in this tiny English script, specifically so his comrades wouldn't be able to read them. It really paints a picture of that suffocating secrecy, doesn't it? But it also highlights a lingering hidden connection to a mother's love that the ideology just couldn't totally stamp out. So what happens to your own free will in a system like that? Poof, it vanishes. The author was performing well in the jungle and genuinely wanted to stay and fight, but leadership abruptly ordered him back to Manila. His quote here is chilling. "I beg to die on the mountain, but the party decision is superior." He had to leave his gear with his cousin, Sandler, and head back to the city. It's a textbook example of philosopher Karl Popper's concept of a closed society. Central command just completely overrides individual choice.
Part 4, the deadly ambush.
This is where the narrative takes a really dark, chilling turn. The source details how an incredibly mundane observation spiraled into an absolute tragedy. The author accidentally noticed the routine of a local police chief. The chief had high blood pressure, right? So he'd personally go to the market on specific days to buy pork. Just think about that for a second. A man's pork-buying habits literally became his death warrant. The author tracked this routine, called an urgent meeting in a cramped nipa hut, and planned a fatal ambush based entirely on these domestic details.
And we can see the real-world fallout right here in these newspaper clippings from 1992. The ambush was carried out and 3 policemen were killed.
The source material forces us to remember that we aren't just discussing abstract political theories in a classroom anymore. We are looking at permanent, fatal actions driven by militant ideology.
But the tragedy didn't end there. It compounded in a way he never expected. While back in Manila, he gets this devastating news. His distant cousin, Sandler, the exact same cousin he had left his boots and gear with, was killed in a military encounter. The author writes this gut-wrenching realization. He died in my place. Standing there before his cousin's body, that blind obedience, the fanaticism he had harbored for years, it finally started to crumble into dust.
Section 5. The ideological collapse.
Right on the heels of this personal tragedy came a massive organizational fracture, and he found out about it in the most jarring way possible. He's just riding a public UP-ICOT jeepney in Manila when a radio announcement blasts out, declaring a formal split between two major factions of the underground movement. Just like that, his absolute certainty is shattered. Because of the split, he realizes he could instantly be viewed as a spy by both sides of his own movement. The ideological safety blanket was just yanked right off.
To really unpack this collapse, the author leans on the philosopher Karl Popper. Just look at the stark contrast between these two systems. In Popper's vision of an open society, criticism is a good thing. It actually improves ideas. Leaders can be swapped out peacefully, and reform is seen as progress. But during the split in the movement's closed dogma, criticism was straight up treated as betrayal. Removal meant violent purges, and rigid dogma was prioritized over human life, night and day.
There's this core tenet in Popper's philosophy called falsifiability. Basically, it means that for a theory to be scientific, it has to be able to be proven wrong by reality. The author realized the movement's grand historicist prophecy was completely unfalsifiable. When the masses didn't rise up, or when operations failed, they never questioned the underlying theory, not once. Instead, leadership would just point fingers at spies or saboteurs, demanding more blood and internal purges just to keep up the illusion of a perfect prophecy.
And finally, Section 6, permission to think.
The crucial endpoint of his entire intellectual journey boils down to this one incredibly powerful realization. What Popper gave me that the party never did, permission to think. By finally grasping that history doesn't have some fixed, inevitable script that justifies violence, the spell of that tarot grooming was broken. He reclaimed his own mind.
But he still had to physically and spiritually cross a threshold, symbolized by this exact church door. He describes showing up to this location and literally collapsing at the slightly open lower panel. He was completely burdened by doubt, by his own pride, and the heavy weight of the lives lost. It was right here, at this doorway, that he finally shed the twisted fanaticism that had been planted in his heart. He made the ultimate choice, his family and his freedom, over a violent, unattainable utopia.
When we look at closed ideologies to raw, real-world survivor accounts, like this deep dive into Chapter 13, it really just boils down to one fundamental question. Do you want a world where your children can ask any question and live? It is a stark, heavy reminder of the immense cost of utopian prophecies and exactly why an open, thinking society is so absolutely crucial. Keep questioning.